all of the churches that existed during that period of time, trying to find records, birth, baptismals, marriages, etc., and they just simply weren't recorded. So it becomes very difficult to try to get genealogical information.
Okay. Um, have you been involved in any repatriation efforts, returning artifacts involved with the indigenous community back to where they belong?
Fortunately, I have. Over the past, I guess, 10 years, I worked along with several other tribal members from different tribes in the state of Maryland. We repatriated a little better than 200 souls back into the earth. And just a few years ago, I was fortunate to hound and chase an archaeologist long enough who wasn't required under NAGPRA or other rules and regulations required by state and federal government to return some human remains that had been moved around the country like as if they were on a traveling road show. They had gone from Maryland to Michigan to Oklahoma to West Virginia to the University of Virginia, and finally we were able to bring them home and put them back in the ground.
That's beautiful. Yeah. That sounds like a happy ending.
Yeah, it was.
At least for those cases that that you worked on. So, are there any out there that you aggressively pursue or want to do the right thing?
Well, there's still plenty out there. I'm not pursuing them myself because one of our other tribal leaders has determined that he wants to pick that up and run with it. And it's my intention to stay out of his way and wish him the best of luck. And if he needs my help or assistance, I'm there to give it anytime he needs it. Hopefully he'll be able to successfully doing that, but those remains are being held by the federal agency, the Smithsonian. And they are staunch supporters of NAGPRA, and they're going to require that we follow the rules and regulations of NAGPRA, which is an interference for state-recognized groups in order to obtain remains that they hold. So we can hope for the best, and hopefully that maybe politicians or someone can put pressure on them, because they're doing nothing with these remains but housing them, and they should be in the ground going back to Mother Earth.
Great, great. I've noticed that as I travel, doing what I do, sleeping in places like this, when I travel to states in the north, it seems like there's a better acknowledgement of the Native American presence that were in those at those particular sites. It's happening somewhat at those southern sites, but have you had an opportunity to monitor how museums and historic sites are telling the stories of the indigenous population?
It would seem that the further you get away from the belly of the beast, as we call it, Washington, D.C., the more exposure Native tribes have. As you go south all the way to Florida, as you go north all the way up into New England, these tribes get a lot of press. They get a lot of support from their states. But as you come and centralize yourself on Washington, D.C., it seems like there's less support for Native tribes. The Virginia tribes have come, well, at least a bunch of them have come out from under that because they've recently received federal acknowledgement. But tribes in New Jersey, Delaware, Pennsylvania, they have yet to get any kind of acknowledgement. Some of them don't even have state status. So again, when you get to New York, Connecticut, Florida, North Carolina, Georgia, you find that those states get benefits, they get acknowledgement, their states are helpful. But again, the closer you get to the center of government, the less help and assistance you find that you get.
Well, one thing that I haven't done yet, it's on my bucket list to do. I have not yet visited the Native American Museum in D.C. I need to assume that you have. Can you tell me anything about that museum?
Well, before the museum opened, I was contacted by Dr. Maynor Sherbeck. She was Lumbee, and she was very concerned that the Eastern Indians have their place in that museum when it opened. They didn't want to be discarded or ignored in favor of the tribes on the western side of the Mississippi. So she talked me into coming for a 6-month contract. I had just retired from another career. Didn't have anything to do, so I said, okay, 6 months, good. That wound up being 6 years. Matter of fact, she retired before I did. Uh, but I enjoyed being there. I loved the work. I was given certain tasks in hand that I was able to really get a grip on. I was given a task of answering letters that came in to Rick West, the director of the museum. Some of the questions that were put to him were very bizarre. And he always told me that don't just send them an answer. Don't give them your opinion. You have to research these questions. Send them citations so they don't question it, so I don't get a follow-up letter. So I followed that to a T. And I enjoyed the time that I was there. And finally, I think a year before I left, they finally put up an exhibit that showed some of the local tribes, the Piscataway, the Nanacoke, and others that are right in this region. So it was, I encourage anybody in the area to go there and see the exhibits that are there. And bear in mind, that museum may seem huge and large, but it only contains 1% of the collection that the museum has. The majority of it is in a facility in Suitland, Maryland, 99% of the collection. They have a library to die for with documentation that people can go out there and do all the research that until they fall asleep in there. But it's a beautiful opportunity to go to that museum and see what's there.
Beautiful. We've got a question. Stephanie?
Yeah, we had a question. So Rico, you were talking earlier about federal recognition. Can you talk a little bit about maybe the advantages or even disadvantages, if there are any, of federal recognition for tribes?
The benefit for federal recognition is having access to funds, whether it's health, employment, education. There's access for funds doing that. State tribes don't have that type of access to funds to pursue those avenues. The federal recognition also gives you what they call sovereignty, but many have called it a kind of sovereignty. It's like being kind of pregnant. You know, either you are or you aren't. We know that Canada and Mexico are sovereign nations. We know the United States addresses itself as a sovereign nation. Nobody can tell another sovereign what to do. But the United States government is always interceding into the business and affairs of the tribes out west who do have sovereignty, even the ones here in the east that have sovereignty. We probably have all heard of the issues that the tribes out west are having with pipelines coming through, pumping oil and natural gas coming through, fracking and other issues that impede on their right as sovereigns, but it is ignored. It seems that their sovereignty has to take a back seat to the dollars that are being earned through these efforts for these big corporations.
Okay. So the indigenous population in slavery, of course, my specialty is slavery in the African American population. I work at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston, South Carolina on a full-time basis, and people often ask me about the Native American presence or the indigenous presence in and around Charleston, South Carolina, and they ask if the Native American population, the indigenous population, was ever enslaved. And my answer is, of course, there was that attempt to do that, but it didn't work. But what did work in the Charleston, South Carolina area is capturing them and taking them to the Caribbean islands and enslaving them there. Any input there?
I think that was the first effort to remove, particularly the tribes up north, those that were in what would become the states of Connecticut and Massachusetts. There were wars that were caused to take place there, and being the loser, they were all packed aboard ships and taken to the Caribbean. It didn't stop there. There were efforts to move the Indians from the Carolinas. There were efforts to move them from Virginia. Big problem is an Indian could go to another village and he could blend. So it would be hard to catch up with them. Many had been moved from one place or another. The Occaneechees and others from out of Florida, they were captured and put into slavery. There was a group of guys called the Carolina Boys that came out of the Caribbean, and they brought a brand of slavery that said was harsher than anything that anybody could ever think of. And they didn't make any distinction between African slaves, and they would capture any Indians that they could and also force them into slavery. I think it was until 1735 when finally the colonies passed laws to outlaw turning American Indians or to making them into chattel slavery.
I've also, in my research, discovered that as enslaved Africans would escape, sometimes they would come in contact with the indigenous population. Mm-hmm. Some were more receptive of them than others. Mm-hmm. The Seminoles, good example. The enslaved Africans assimilated with them well. Is that a correct assessment?
Absolutely. I can't find anything documented where any native tribe turned its back on Africans if they were able to get it to a village. As a matter of fact, many of the colonies would threaten the tribes that if they didn't turn those escaped slaves over, that they would hold them accountable, that they would arrest the tribal leaders and either charge them fines or they ran the risk of being hung. So those threats worked in some cases, but in most cases it did not. Native Americans never had any difficulty accepting Africans into the fold, with some exceptions historically. But for the most part, it wasn't. Even in the Carolinas, there's a gentleman that wrote a book, The Only Land They Knew, where in order to protect those of the native people that worked for them, especially the ones that had intermarried with the Africans, that he would make sure that they identified not as Indians so they would not be removed off of his plantation.
In my travels and finding places to sleep in that apply to the mission of the Slave Dwelling Project, mm-hmm. I've slept at the Hermitage, the home of President Andrew Jackson. Of course, we know that he is known for Indian removal. When I went there, they do an adequate job at telling the stories of his action in that process. There is an effort now to put Harriet Tubman on the $20 bill. Have you weighed in on that one way or the other?
No, but I'm not a fan of Andrew Jackson by any measure. I have read both his biography, etc., and historical documents about him. Definitely not a favorite person of any native, especially how he came to his notoriety, if you will. What he did at Horseshoe Bend with the tribes there, how he set them out front, used them as bait in order to win a skirmish. What he did to the tribes in Florida when he decided that the Spaniards had to go, what he did to them in the same fashion of taking them out. If they were in the way, if they weren't hung, they were shot. So Andy Jackson wasn't one of our favorite people by any measure.
Mm-hmm. I've also had the opportunity in my travels to spend the night at Fort Snelling. Of course, my interest in that and the Slave Dwelling Project, of course, the Dred Scott story. Mm-hmm. But a deeper story at Fort Snelling is, of course, purging of indigenous people. We would send our armies out there to do just that. And Fort Snelling, the purpose of Fort Snelling was that. Any knowledge of Fort Snelling and what went on there? I know that President Zachary Taylor was a part of that effort. Any input there?
I'm not too familiar with that particular fort, but the idea and the actual process of removal mm-hmm. is something that I'm fairly familiar with. A lot of people aren't familiar with tribes being removed other than the Cherokee, or what they call the 5 civilized tribes. But many of the tribes that were in Louisiana, Arkansas, they were removed also. Many of the people here in the state of Maryland were also removed. It took a long time, and I'm still trying to find some proof of it, that other than an interview I did of a gentleman maybe 20 years ago, he was in his late 90s, recalled his grandfather taking him to a place where tribes here in Maryland were boarded onto a train and sent to an area in Oklahoma called Going Snake. I've been in touch with the University of Oklahoma and others trying to get information on that, and I've come up blank. But I'm sure if I keep digging, I'll probably come up with something that didn't have. But removal Removal was one of the big things. A lot of people attribute it to Jackson, but it started before Jackson got in the White House.
Yes, yes. Um, I'm familiar. When we were talking earlier, you referenced a book. In fact, you had it. Do you have that book now? Can you tell me about that book?
See, bad asked me, I told you. The gentleman, the way I came across that book, there was a letter that the director at the museum had received asking about that very question, with Native Americans and their involvement in slavery, either as slavers or as slaves. And following my directive to be very thorough, to give citations to whatever I was citing in these responses, I was able to note that with all the material that I came up and the vast resources at the Smithsonian, that in every bibliography they had this one guy, his name was Gallen, that had a book, American Indian Slavery. And so that became sort of my Bible, if you will, in looking for information that had anything to do with Native Americans and dealing with slavery.
I often, when I'm speaking to my audiences, I tell them about my upbringing, the education that I got as a young person and an influential person, of course, in the educational system. Not learning anything about my past that at that time made me proud. Of course, I had to purge my mind of a lot of what was taught to me. One thing that didn't help was Hollywood and the movies that I would see, the westerns that I would see. It painted a bad picture of the indigenous population. Was that some of your experience?
Well, when as a young person, we didn't have TV, but my earliest experience is as a very young person. I was taken to Indian boarding school in Pennsylvania, not Carlisle. I wasn't the only one in Pennsylvania. I was taken to one in Bucks County that was run by an order of nuns that happened to have been started by Catherine Drexel of the Drexels of Philadelphia. They had the wherewithal to build these schools. They built them across the country, both in the Southwest, in the South, and in the Great Lakes region. I was there for, I guess, what would you call my formative years, and there was no television. I don't think that I really got to look at TV until somewhere in the early 50s, mid 50s. And I was astonished, to see some of these movies. I have a couple of friends now that still work at the museum, and I tell them that I look to watch these old movies, not to be absorbed by them or to be indoctrinated by them, but to see what was wrong with them and how people came to the wrong ideas by watching them. It is, and you have to force yourself to watch it because it is painful, it's hurtful, and it's nowhere near the truth. So I watch it now, but I didn't have that impact that a child would have by watching them because I didn't have that opportunity. But if I had the time and the aptitude, I probably would write some kind of a book or something about the negative impact that these films would have on young people, because they still show them, and there are young people looking at them and believing that this is what happened.
Yeah, it really did something to me. And again, I had to purge my mind of a lot of it. I had a situation once when I was in South Dakota. I was doing a TED Talk there, and one of the presenters, another one of the people doing the TED Talk, was an indigenous person. They did their talk, and in the audience was a group of indigenous youth. And in the breakout session, we had a situation where a white female just started talking negatively about the indigenous population, and it really upset this young Native American female, and she started crying, and I had to comfort her, and I had to challenge this white female that was coming off in the manner that she did. But I'm sure that's attributed to her environment, what she learned, some of the things I talked about, some of the things she may have read, some of the things that she may have seen on TV or the big screen, and she brought all those prejudices with her. And for her to talk to this young Native American or indigenous female that way was just disrespectful. So I have experienced that. So let me go to our off-screen moderators. I think we have a question over there.
Yeah, we had a couple questions about reservations. The first question is, what do you think about gambling on reservations? And the second question is, are reservations a good thing? Are they a sanctuary or are they a trap?
Before you answer that, it might be necessary for me to repeat the question because I don't know if our folks that are looking at this can hear our off-screen moderators asking the question. But it's about casinos and your opinion on casinos.
Well, it's opportunity for tribes that are able to have a market for it. All tribes that have tried casinos weren't successful because you've got to be somewhere where there's traffic. I mean, if nobody's going to go 200-300 miles to go to a casino if there's one within half an hour, an hour's drive. So some of them have been successful, others have failed. Many of them that have the casinos are now turning that money into other enterprises in order to expand the opportunities for some of their young people, both to get an education and to have employment. So it's a slow process, but they're getting into it, and they're not going to stand and just let the casinos be the only avenue that they have to generate income. As far as reservations, it's what they've got. You know, Maryland, at one point, we had 6 reservations here on the western shore of Maryland. After the American Revolution, that land was basically given away to those who had supported the revolution as payment. And we were basically disowned from the land. Out west, there are still efforts to diminish the amount of footprint that they have as reservations, because a lot of people are seeing that the resources in terms of oil, natural gas, and other elements that they can get that turn into money and into resources for financial gain. So they're doing the best they can out there to hold on to what they've got and to make sure that they're not encroached on by business to come up with the ways and means and to diminish the footprint, the little bit of a footprint that they have left.
Just recently, the Supreme Court ruled in Oklahoma in the favor of indigenous people. Any input about that?
Well, from the way I read, a lot of people assumed that it was giving the tribes in Oklahoma some upper hand on everybody. But basically what it determined was that crimes committed on the reservation heretofore, that if you were not a tribal member, you could commit your crime and leave. They had no jurisdiction over you. You had to wait for the FBI or the federal government to come in and then take them off the reservation in order to prosecute them. And in most cases, the prosecutions failed. They are saying that if you're on that reservation, you're on Indian land. And that if you commit a crime, then you will be subject to tribal justice. So, and I'm sure that tribal justice won't be the traditional form of justice, but they have their constitutions and they have their laws that people have to follow. Because people have been coming on reservations, just doing as they please. Most people have heard about the missing and murdered indigenous women that wind up disappearing off these reservations, and if they're found dead, nobody's investigating it. So hopefully that what they did in Oklahoma will be opening a door for some of the other areas, both here in the United States and in Canada, to help stop that kind of miscarriage.
Beautiful, beautiful. And we do have a question from our off-screen moderator.
So first, there is a comment from Chris saying that this is definitely a wonderful conversation that we're having tonight. But the question that Chris has asked is, can you speak to the Native Americans who owned African Americans in the Southeast and in Oklahoma? And how was this reconciled, and what is its legacy today?
The question is Native Americans owning African Americans, enslaving people, and what's the effect of that today? What's the residuals of that today?
Well, one of the things that you have to bear in mind that what were called the 5 civilized tribes, possibly with the exception of the Seminole, in order to, in their minds, seek equality, imitated the United States in its handling of slaves. But when you look into it, you find out that they were not treated as chattel. They could intermarry with members of the tribe. They could become leaders in the tribe. They were given their own land to farm. But they were held out to be, for public purposes, to be quote unquote slaves. When they decided to move the Cherokee over and the rest of the 5 civilized tribes, with the exception of the Seminoles, it'd be a while before they could get the Seminoles moved. When they went into Oklahoma, to what's called Indian Territory, when the United States, after the American Revolution, after the Civil War rather, told the Cherokee tribe that for the United States not to have any liability or responsibility for those persons that the tribe had held as slaves, that the tribe had to absorb them into their population. And the tribes were, you're not doing that with anybody else. Why are you forcing the fact that now that this is over, slaves are free? Why can't they go about wherever they want to go about? They're free, just like they are in every other place. But the United States saw an added liability and something that would pull on the purse strings. But there were a lot of cases recently that have gone to court, and the United States justice system, again, going into the reservation, overruled what took place there, and have decided that the Cherokees were required to take the Africans that had previously were the descendants of previous people that they owned as chattel or otherwise, that they had to be enumerated as part of the tribe and to enjoy whatever benefits inured to the tribe by benefit of their federal recognition. So last I've heard, there's been no more discussion or argument about it. They've been absorbed fully into the tribe with full citizenship.
Mm-hmm. Well, proportionately, COVID-19 is devastating, well, disproportionately, excuse me. COVID-19 is devastating to the African American community. Does that hold true for the indigenous population?
It does indeed. You may have heard where several of them, like in Montana or several, they shut off the routes coming into the reservations so that interstate traffic would stop. The governors of a couple of those states wanted federal action, even to bring in whoever and whatever to make them move these roadblocks, because they were hurting the bottom line. It was hurting the state economically. But fortunately, the court said, no, they are sovereign. And there are other means for you getting to where you want to go besides going through their reserves. So that has happened. But you take a tribe, one of the largest, the Navajo, they have suffered disproportionately than anyone else, even to the fact where we were sending PPE down to them because they were totally out of them. They were starting to fall off like flies and getting nothing from the federal government to help them with that crisis that they were experiencing. And you have to rely on the media to give you feedback. I haven't heard much lately as to what the numbers that are dying down there on the Navajo reservation. But as big as that reservation is, with the number of people that were there and with the poor health service that they're getting, with the monies that have been reduced for the Indian Health Service, they're not getting the type of medical attention that anybody else would expect. And it's the government's responsibility, because of the treaties that they signed, to give away most of their homeland in exchange for the federal government to extend them these benefits, and they're not doing it.
We've got an off-screen comment.
Okay, wait, so we have one comment. They can't hear me. I'm all mic'd up. Hi, everybody. Stephanie here, the archaeologist. So we had one comment for you, Rico. I think the comment, he says, the question, what about y'all owning slaves, always seems to come up in these types of conversations, but you were nailing the distinction. So that's a good comment.
Did you hear it?
And then we were just talking about some Western tribes, and we had a question. So do you think that Western tribes are treated as living cultures more than Eastern tribes? And if so, why? And then going on, how do we educate people about the vibrant Eastern indigenous cultures as well?
Did you hear the question?
You want to repeat it? I caught most of it. You want to repeat it? Repeat the question, please?
A little louder, please.
I'm sorry, you need to get that question again?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Question was, do you think that Western tribes are treated as living cultures more than Eastern tribes? And if so, why? And following up with that, how do we educate people about the fact that there are vibrant Eastern indigenous cultures?
Okay, the first answer to the first part of that is yes. There is a difference in how tribes out west are treated as opposed to tribes in the east. Mainly because the tribes out west, the United States, for the most part, weren't even aware they were there until nearly into the 1800s. So by the 1800s, they had, to use a term, kicked us to the curb. They had been doing a number on us since the middle of the 17th century. So they got a 200-year head start on being able to displace us, to convert us to a different religion, to take the livelihood that we had, to completely alter our worldview in terms of how we sustained our lives, how we got our food, the technology that we had to use, and there was no training for Native people in the East to be able to move into a culture that was being foisted upon them without their asking and without them having any means of resisting. Out west, entirely different story. You're talking about a very large country, and the tribes were able to sustain their traditions and their culture and their ceremonies long after ours had been taken away from us. There is a resurgence in the East where the tribes are trying to regain some of their tradition, their life ways, their worldview, and it's a very slow undertaking. Again, it took 300 years for this to happen. So, it's not going to happen overnight that the Eastern tribes are going to regain what they lost. Number one, they've got to be able to determine what they did lose. One of the first things is language. That was one of the first things that were taken from anybody, including the Africans. The first thing to go is your language. Second to go is your religion. Second to go is you're going to earn a living the way I give it to you, not the way you were used to doing it. So it's a slow process. Hopefully it won't take 300 more years to get there. Because tribes are working on it. They're working on regaining some of their tradition, their ceremonies, their language, and their worldview and way of life. But again, it's a slow process, but it is happening. One of the things, again, that detains us, as was stated earlier, we don't have federal acknowledgement, mainly because there was no United States at the time for us to have a treaty with. We were under the British rule in the colonies. Now, we did have treaties with Britain, but the United States will not respect any treaty that you had with Britain. If your treaty wasn't with the United States, then you will be ignored.
So how strong is the Piscataway presence in this area?
It depends on who you talk to. I've heard anywhere from a tribal complement of 3,000 to 13,000 souls. It depends on whether or not they can meet the established criteria to enroll in the tribe, which is, again, difficult to do because of a lack of official records. And you have to depend upon the state or the church or the courts in order to find records that the state is willing to accept. We have oral history, but that's not acceptable because Granny could lie, or it may be information that they can refute. So if you can't get it from legitimate sources that they determine what that source is, and again, the three that I mentioned, the church, the government or the military, or if you got locked up, then you got a record you can fall back on. But without that, it's hard to prove who you are, and it's unfortunate that Native people are the only ones that are required to do that. But the fallback on that is that if any and everybody was able to step up and say, "Yay, hey, I am," and there's any benefits to be gained, then you have that issue. It wasn't until we gained state status that we had eligibility to apply for any state benefits as far as employment or training, because state regulations stated that in order for you to qualify, say for minority contracting, you had to be a member of a federal or state acknowledged tribe, and Maryland at that time had none. So that was one of the bats that we were able to swing, that we were being denied an opportunity, because if you go all the way back to the 1700s, Native men were not given an opportunity to learn the same skills that the yeomen from Europe or that slaves were being trained to do. They would learn great skills of carpentry, husbandry, shoes, barrel makers, you name it. They gained talent. They gained credible ways to make a living. But natives didn't get that opportunity.
Despite all the disenfranchisement of blacks, we have a very commendable military presence. In other words, serving for these United States. Does the same apply for the indigenous population?
It does. Again, it depends on whose truth you listen to. You know, I know that most natives will say that on a percentile basis, given populations, that natives serve at a higher percentile than any other group. A friend of mine was very proud of the fact that his young son just entered into the Marine Corps. And the Marine Corps seemed to be the accepted branch of service that most natives, especially those in the West, will go into. I guess the Marines are more of a die hard, go at it type group. And if you can make it there, it's like being in New York, you can make it anywhere. But yeah, there's a percentage on a percentile basis. There are Native Americans that do. Now there's an argument, why do they? It might be because of the lack of opportunities that they have on reservations. It might be because of the lack of opportunity for education on the reservations. So whatever the motivation is, the idea is they know they can go in the military, come out, get that VA, and be able to have medical care that they're not going to get from Indian Health Service. Because one thing people don't understand about Indian Health Service, if you're more than a certain distance away from an Indian Health Service facility, you can't get health care. So there's always that little niche that Native men, particularly, and women, will go into the military so that they can have a future.
Great, great. Now, DNA, which is a touchy subject for a lot of people. In the African American community, you will see various hues of us. And I'm assuming that applies to the indigenous population also. Any input there?
Well, it's the same goes for the Indian population. You can go anywhere, particularly in the East, because again, as I stated earlier, natives did not have a prejudiced bones in their body. And women in particular, especially during that period where Indian men were basically almost made obsolete because they had no careers other than hunting. When the beaver trade played out, when the deer population had been decimated and they couldn't get hides, they had no skill sets to fall back on. So what were they to do? Women, on the other hand, was like, they didn't care, well, you know, what the color of your skin was. Can you do what I expect a man to do? So the choice of a mate depended on not having someone that was given to drink or no skills to be able to provide for a family. Whereas if an African could, then they would get married. So you have a population of people with mixed ethnicity, especially in the East. So, and those numbers have increased over the years. bar none, because there's a big thing among many of the tribes that a lot of the members of a tribe believe that they're too related to have any type of a relationship with each other. You know, it's like you're my cousin, I can't be bothered with you. So there's that fact. But you know, that's something that has happened and continues to happen, and I don't see it slowing down. DNA, there's always big arguments about DNA. I know a lot of people in the tribe that have got their DNA done, and when it comes back, no Indian. Well, you know, I try to explain to them, it's like if you weren't at the scene of the crime, then your DNA is not going to show up. I don't care how much blood you give them. There's no database for most Eastern tribes for them to make a comparison with. You have to have that comparison. And they want to get it, based on what I've read, they want to draw blood from somebody who is of pure stock. When they did the Genome Project all the way across Europe, Africa, and this country, they tried to find people that had not intermarried with anybody else so they could get a pure strain of DNA. Where on the East Coast is that you're going to find that? And it's hard to get people to understand that. And then when they get their results back, you know, it's like their body parts are like a jigsaw puzzle. You're like, you're from everywhere and nowhere. So, you know, why did you get that done? You know, I tell people, do your genealogy. And I get a lot of turt remarks about, you know, doing genealogy, how they're going to do it when you can't trace your people back more than 2 or 3 generations. Well, if you put your back to it and put your mind to it and you go out and look behind door number 2, you will be able to find it. There are records out there. Again, if you had a great-great-great-grandfather that got locked up, that record is still there. It's still there. If they were involved in the church, chances are that record is there. We ran into an issue of finding in the church records where many natives, women especially, bore children to the European men. And when some of the families found out, they complained to the archdiocese to shut us off. They didn't want anybody to know about this track record of their family back in the day. So, but it is out there. But you have to hunt for it. You know, it's like trying to find that Hope diamond.
Mm-hmm.
You got to want it.
Yes. We've got an off-screen question.
Okay, so the question of reparations came up. What do you think about reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans and for Native people?
Oh, reparations for enslaved Africans and indigenous population. Let me talk, well, I can speak on the one about enslaved Africans. Well, I think that any reparations that is paid, and I think that we'll get around to that. There's more discussion about that now, especially in this current political season. I think that any reparations that pay should be paid forward. In other words, I'm not looking for anybody to do any math that's going to award me a certain amount of money. But if an endowment can be created that we could live off the interest or draw money off the interest of that for future generations, if that means educating somebody to the next level or you know, creating, you know, funds to a system or whatever assistance that they need, then I think that should be. Another thing about that is we need to track this old money. You know, accumulating wealth, the ability for enslavers to accumulate wealth meant that where they got that wealth from disenfranchised those who were enslaved. So the ability for the formerly enslaved to accumulate wealth was still challenged because of the things that replaced slavery, like convict labor, Jim Crow laws, lynchings, all that stuff factored into the freedom that was now had for African Americans. And of course, you know, you bring that forward, you got redlining, you've got poll taxes, again, those efforts to disenfranchise. It's going to take centuries to balance that. So I think, you know, establishing an endowment of some sort helps that process. Take Georgetown University, which is very close to where we are right now. You know, they sold enslaved people just to remain solvent. Well, what they're doing today is they're offering a discount on the tuition for the descendants of those people that they sold. That's paying it forward to me. And some of the students that are enrolled there now, they said, well, charge me extra on my tuition, and because it's going to go into this fund that at somewhere in the future, someone wanting to attend this university can benefit from that. So, that's my take on reparations.
Well, my take on it takes me back to the Cobell Lawsuit. The Cobell Lawsuit was brought against the Department of the Interior because the department was managing land for tribes out west, and they were renting the land out to large cattle interests. And as it turned out, they were renting it out at subpar rates, so cheap that it was absolutely ridiculous that they would rent native property out for those kind of rates. Cobell Lawsuit went on, I know, for probably the full 8 years of George Bush's administration. That's the second George Bush, the son. During that time, he had people from the Justice Department go out to those tribes and try to induce tribal members to take money. And it's the same way that they have since the 1800s been trying to induce the Lakota to take money for the Black Hills, where the founding fathers are carved into what is known as the Six Hills by the natives. The United States put a certain amount of money in sort of a trust account for payment for the Black Hills. But the tribes have refused to accept it and keep telling them they're not for sale. I don't care how much money you put up, the hills are not for sale. Take your money and go. And we'll see that a recent demonstration at the hills for, I think it was the 4th of July, some of the Lakota were there to protest them being there and doing that, and called it sacrilege that they would be there doing it. And the leader of it was arrested and threatened with spending the next 15 years of his life in jail for having the audacity to be on his own land to protest this. But to get to your question, as far as reparations with Maryland, the land that was set aside as reservations, there were 6 here on the western shore, several others on the eastern shore. Any question about that, any restitution about the land for like the state of Maryland is a no-go show, but again, because that happened under the rule of the British. The United States had nothing to do with it. And to me, that's like somebody going in witness protection saying they had nothing to do with the crime they committed before they went into witness protection. You can't change your name and get away with that, but they have and they will.
I recently, more often now, we find a lot of intersectionality. We noticed a few years ago, I think it was in a state out west, a Midwestern state, a water pipeline was, well, some type of pipeline was being constructed or created, and it ran through indigenous land. And people coalesced around the cause to prevent that from happening. And I'd lost touch with what went on with that. Any input?
Yeah, it was an oil pipeline that was being pushed through native land, and some of it was called what's considered to be sacred land. And this was being ignored. It seemed like that the oil coming through, going down to Louisiana to be shipped out, was of more importance than any rights, privileges, or reservation set-asides that were being given to the tribes. The courts have ruled on the side of the tribes that them coming through was illegal, that they needed to have the permission of the tribes because they were sovereign nations and they should have consulted with them before bringing those pipelines through. It went back to court, and another judge said, no, that court was wrong. Now it's back in court again for another judge to say the second judge was right. No, you cannot take a pipeline through a reservation without the permission of the tribe. But you know, for every time you see this, then they go to another court. And it's a never-ending carousel of American jurisprudence that goes nowhere. And meanwhile, they're back to wanting to bring these teams out and start redoing these pipes, in spite of not having a final decision from the courts. So yeah, I mean, what are the tribes to do? Arm themselves and go out and start firing at these guys? They don't stand a chance because they're already there with armed militiamen to protect these guys as they start bringing these pipelines through.
There's a recent effort to to educate in our educational system and what we teach our children. There's this effort now to deter the kinds of conversations that we're having right now. Of course, I concentrate on slavery and the legacy that is left on this nation. Of course, you are a defender of your history, but there's this effort through this thing called the Patriotic Education Commission to squelch it all, to tap it down, if you will. Of course, I'm not for that, because I'm all about finding places like these and making sure that the whole story of these places are told. You know, I want to tell the story about the people who live inside these walls. I want to tell the story of the people who made all this possible. I want to tell the story of the people who made the bricks that's now this house, who cut down the trees that that frame this house, whose labor was stolen for this to be built. So, what's your input in this most recent development?
It's kind of put a handle on it. Education, and I have to stay with the state of Maryland because I haven't looked at that far. 10 years ago, I was one of the people that was selected to work with the State Board of Education under a mandate by former Governor O'Malley, to see that American Indian history for the Maryland tribes was included in their curriculum from elementary through high school. We spent several years working with the State Board of Education, 6 of the tribes, and at that time no tribe was recognized. We developed material to go into that iteration of those books, and they focused all of the attention on the 3rd and 4th grade readers. I guess when children are at the most impressionable age. When the books came out, one of the leaders of it from the commission called me and asked me had I seen the final product. And I said no. So she made it available to me, and it's like, why did we bother? To add fuel to the fire, just recently, again, I was contacted by the company who has been charged with redoing for this iteration, because 10 years has gone by, every 10 years they do another iteration, to weigh in with comments on what they have for these readers. And again, 3rd and 4th grade. And I've been very vocal in responding back to them with my suggestions and the borderlines of this as to what my comments are. And it just amazed me that the first thing out of the box for somebody in the 3rd and 4th grade, the first thing they're going to read about natives is that we came across the Bering Strait. End of story. You know, no other, what we think and what we know and what we believe, irrelevant. You know, it's what they say, and that's the end of the story. And I've been pretty, not vocal, but, you know, I've been, I guess, vocal in a way anyhow, and I've been addressing, they're now into part 5, and I'm continually sending them my opinions about what they're exposing children of that young age to. And you make it wonder when you talk to adults and you say things to them and they'll say things to you and you'll ask them, where did you get that information? I don't remember. Well, you got it when you were 7 years old. It was impressed upon you at a young, impressionable age, and you've never been told any different. So the education system is still feeding and breeding that same disinformation, misinformation about Native people as they are about anybody else except those part of the elite, if you will. But I don't see a change. Another 10 years has gone by since the last iteration of these books, and they're putting the same stuff in. And I'll be looking to see what the final product is, to see exactly what, if anything, they've amended in order to justify spending money for another iteration to tell the same story.
Interesting. We've got a comment.
So we do have a comment from Artura, our Black History Program historian here with the Commission. And to tie into what you guys are talking about with education, and also, Joe, what you mentioned about Georgetown, Artura brought it to our attention that slaves who worked at Georgetown were sold from a plantation in Bowie, Maryland, actually here in Prince George's County.
Great, thank you. and hey, and yeah, the Georgetown University and the selling of enslaved people to remain solvent. It was just stated, and thank you for pointing it out that those enslaved people were sold from a plantation here in Maryland. In my travels, I've met one of the descendants of those enslaved people who was sold to a plantation in Louisiana. All right, Columbus Day. Columbus Day is being minimized in a lot of places. In fact, some places are going a step further in substituting Columbus Day for Indigenous American Day. Any input?
Well, some years ago, a former member of the, well, he was a member of the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs at the time, attempted to bring about that change to get rid of Columbus Day. And this was back during the Glendenning administration. And he was basically chastised for having done so. The Italian community of Baltimore in particular came out and told the governor that if he did anything about that, they would make sure he didn't have a second term. It wasn't the first time he had been threatened about not having a second term, dealing either with the American Indians. But ultimately, it's gained traction. It's much like that football team in D.C. It gained traction. In that case, it took money. The threat of losing money won the day. You know, the fact that it was wrong didn't have relevance. And the same thing goes with, you know, with Columbus Day. I got a call from the county council in Prince George's County to come and testify before them to give my opinion about Columbus and Columbus Day. And I was very glad for that opportunity to expose to them some information that they had not heard, weren't aware of. And again, based on my training, was able to give them citations. It's not my opinion. Here's where you go find this information about this guy that you want to celebrate and give him a holiday. And this guy who has never stepped foot on this part of the continent. You know, and now Prince George County has dropped Columbus Day in favor of Indigenous Day.
You mentioned that football team. I don't do NFL anymore. I'm with Colin Kaepernick, and Colin Kaepernick, like me, connects the dot. It's about equal justice. That's I'm in that camp with him. That football team, the Washington football team, there are other teams that are kind of in that same pot with that football team. So any input there?
Well, they are, and there's action being taken. So far, we don't know how far it's going to go. They're not going to change these names like the Kansas City Chiefs or the Atlantic Hawks, you know, doing the chop and these kind of things. It seems that the social impacts, negative as they are, don't mean as much if there's some kind of way that the sponsors, those who are doling out the dollars to these teams, that is what seems to matter to them. So I don't know how it's going to play out with the Chiefs and with the Atlanta team, and especially most of the universities have dropped them. Trying to get high schools to drop them is another matter. And there are plenty, especially here in the state of Maryland, that have names that should not be on these teams with young people playing these sports to be impressed, to think that there's something right about it. But it's a work in progress, and we're hoping that ultimately there won't be any disparaging names out there, in spite of some people thinking that it honors, we're honoring you. Well, I got some names I'd like to plant to tell you I'm honoring you.
There might be kids listening.
But that's not acceptable. So it's a work in progress. Again, it took dollars, and that's what some people, that's their manner, and that's what they speak to. That's what they believe in, the almighty dollar. And it has shown its power with that Washington team.
Right. So let me yield to our off-screen moderators. Any input from our off-screen moderators?
Yeah, we have another question. So, you're kind of talking about cultural appropriation. What about things like dream catchers and saging and that sort of thing? Is that, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, dream catchers are something that has caught on, that was done by tribes, basically for the psychological aspects for young children and infants. Sometimes if I tell you there's something behind you, don't look, you may have a hissy fit because you think I'm telling you the truth. And the dream catchers, the intent of them is to stop children from having bad dreams. And in many instances, it is seen that it can influence what a child might dream about in their sleep. There are other cultural appropriations that are going on, mainly the smudging, sweat lodges, wearing of headdresses. That goes on, especially with the headdresses in the modeling venue. The smudging, people are doing it all over the place, not understanding the relevance or the proper method of doing it. It's not a fad. It's a spiritual thing, and if you're not within that spiritual qualm, then why are you doing it? It's mockery. Most of those things that are being misappropriated, sweat lodges. People think that going in a sweat lodge is something to do like going into a Swedish sauna. It's not. I've been barred from going into them by my doc. But we know of one case out in the Midwest where a gentleman had attended a sweat. So having gone through it, he considered himself that he knew how to conduct a sweat. He wound up killing 3 people. It's not something to play with. If you don't know what you're doing, then you need to stay out of it and don't appropriate cultural things that you just don't know the ins and outs of it.
Yeah, cultural appropriation. That's something we hear often in the African American community. Yeah. So I, in all my travels, where I go and find places like this, sleeping in places like this, I often encounter people of the indigenous population. We sit around campfires and we have conversations. And we talk about those things that people aren't afraid to talk about amongst people who look like them. Mm-hmm. But when you add elements of people of different demographic, it gets more interesting. So I encourage, these kinds of conversations often. Mm-hmm. So that's why I'm hoping that, we can continue to have these kind of conversations, and we can be ambassadors for our cause. Mm-hmm. I can be an ambassador for mine, and you are an ambassador for yours. It's just that, there's going to be a time in the future, in the near future, probably not in my lifetime, I don't know your age, but certainly probably not in my lifetime, where the demographics of this nation is going to shift. Yeah. In other words, whites aren't going to be the majority anymore. They're going to be, at some point in the future, the minority. So there's a lot of pushback to that. There's a lot of efforts to try to prevent that from happening. Voter suppression, closing down borders, banning Muslims, and things of this nature. And I'm hoping that, that we are preparing our youth. Actually, our youth are preparing us for that day. And I'm looking at that time in the future that we can take in all this information and not feel threatened by it. Mm-hmm. If we have to appropriate some culture, then sometimes that's okay. But you got to be careful, as you just stated. If you don't know what you're doing, you got to get that training. You got to get the know-how. You stated, talked about a man killing 3 people. Didn't know what he was doing. Thought he had it all together, but it was wrong. So I'm hoping, again, in the future that that we could take in all this information and learn to live as diverse people, the diverse nation that we are. We have a question.
Yes, we do. Our question we have is, how can white people be better allies to both Native people and African Americans?
Well, I would say respect the culture, don't mimic it, don't adopt and adapt those things that you see natives doing and figuring that if you acquire it or wear it, that somehow that's making you a buddy. But we're open to any dialogue with anyone, irrespective of their race, creed, religion, national origin of their parents, great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents. This country has become a mixing bowl. There are people here from every country on this planet. And that's not going to change. Europeans are not going back to Europe. Africans are not going back to Africa. Mexicans aren't going, well, I say Mexican, but they're Native Americans. They just speak the language of a European conqueror, like I speak English because it's the language of the European conqueror here. But this country is a melting pot. And people come here for various and particular reasons to satisfy whatever their current urges or needs are. And that's not going to change. Not unless everything that's available here becomes exhausted, then everybody will figure there's another place I'd rather be. But right now, this is the place to be. It's a beautiful country. It's a wonderful country. There's enough here for everybody. We can all enjoy it and get some parts of it. It's just that it takes some fairness in how the game is going to be played. And I hate to refer to it as a game, but most people will understand how games are played. But we need, let's say, equity. We need justice, diversity, involvement, interaction among all of us. We need understanding, not anybody thinking that they're superior to anybody or inferior to another person. Whether that will ever happen in my lifetime, I don't know. But I continually, not so much, but I send up smoke in prayer, hoping that'll happen. And that's another thing that's appropriated, is the native process of prayer. But we don't expose that to a lot of people. But we're hoping that things get better.
Yeah.
And we're sure that they will, in spite of current circumstances.
Well, as far as the white people and getting along with the African American community, I think it's 2 words that you use. You use superior and inferior. We need to eliminate supremacy, white supremacy. We got to think about, 1789, our gathering in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, at our Constitutional Convention, and the fact that, the Southerners wanted 20 more years to import people into this nation for the purpose of enslaving them because, their economy depended on it, and they got there 20 years. That right then and there, that institution of slavery could have been halted right there, but we didn't do it. And when we talked about, all men are created equal, but 3/5 is a fraction. That's not a whole number. We went with that in the Constitution. We the people. Those men in that room were all white men, property-owning white men. And that same Constitution had to be amended many times to include me. And when we think about the things that, we placed slavery, yeah, we're free. The Civil War ended slavery, it didn't end prejudice, and we're still dealing with the residuals of all that. And I think the hope is, our youth, they see a better world. my daughter is practicing that. I'm proud to see how she is applying equality in her life. So she gives me hope. So I think if we can get rid of the thought process of superiority or white supremacy, because in order for someone to be superior, someone has to be inferior. And if we can eliminate that, and we can, take on that, what's written on the Statue of Liberty, about huddled masses, and because we are a huddled mass. We're a very young nation. We are suffering growing pains, and I hope that on the other side of this, that we can have more conversations like this, and we don't need these kinds of conversations to be choked. We don't need anybody to tell us that what we're doing right now is forbidden, is illegal, or we could be censored for having these kinds of conversations. I want to talk to more people like you. I want to talk to people who don't look like me about race relations, and I want to be able to walk away from those conversations thinking that, hey, we accomplished something. We may have disagreed on some of the points, but we agreed on some. And as long as we can come together again and have these kinds of conversations, that's hope. Any other comments or questions?
We did have one more question kind of along those lines, Joe. So how do you change that narrative?
Yeah, well, you have to be persistent to change a narrative. I mean, you could talk about we need change, but it's got to be actions too. You talked about the book. Comes around every 10 years. They ask for your opinion, but they do very little or nothing. But you still there. You are still there. You're still persistent. They still seek your knowledge. They still seek your input. And maybe that third, fourth, whatever, fifth time, it may take. Sometimes it takes those extra efforts to do that. And then changing narratives. We've been telling a false story for so long. Well, incomplete, maybe not false, but incomplete story for so long. We've been sugarcoating our history. For so long, we've got people comfortable. We got them in a comfort zone. We need to pull them out of there. And when they visit a site like this, we want to tell you about all this gloriousness that you see, that you witness. But we also want you to go around that building and see that brick with those fingerprints in there. And we want to tell you the story about who made those fingerprints. We want that to be a part of the story also. If we're going to talk about Columbus, talk about all the things about Columbus. Tell them that, well, you can't discover a place as with people already in it. That's again, that's that sugar coating, that's that false narrative. We have to be persistent.
Well, that reminds me of the line in a movie. I think it was Danny Glover was in it, and he worked for the senator. And the senator told this guy when he said something about the truth, and he told him, "The truth is what I say it is." and there are a lot of people that have that attitude, that you can't argue with them. You can't have another opinion, that it's their way or you got trouble. So that is still going on, but it's going to take informing people, educating people, and getting people to take the time to open a book, turn the TV off, get off that phone, and do a little background checking and seeing what reality is about. Otherwise, you're stuck with accepting the truth that somebody else gives you, and you have to swallow it like a pill.
Yeah, I come across a lot of people like that. I'm also a Civil War reenactor, more a living historian now. But years ago, 25, 30 years ago, when I first became a reenactor, Civil War reenactor, I would have conversations with people who served the other sides, as in the Confederate side, Confederate reenactors. And some of those guys, man, their mind, the place where their mind is a place I'd never want to be. because they are reenacting because they want to actually change the outcome of the war. Um,
Still,
but I still had conversation with those guys. I they got into my mind, I got into theirs.
Yeah.
We were just exchanging information. We just agreed on a whole lot of stuff. But we still had those conversations. We still had that dialogue, and that's the thing that has made me capable of coming to places like this, prior to the coronavirus, and gathering people and sitting around a campfire and having conversations about race relations, having conversations about, weddings on plantations and white supremacy and historical trauma. And all the things that's pertinent to talk about that people don't usually talk about with people who don't look like them. Feel uncomfortable. Yes, I felt uncomfortable, sitting around the campfire, hearing the things some of those guys were saying. But still, it's necessary.
Yeah. It's hard to hear some of those things that people have to say, and they don't pull back on it, but I simply try to send people that have those negative barbs in their hand in a direction where they can get information from a third source, because usually all they're going to do is argue with you. So I try to send them in another direction so they can argue with somebody they might have respect for. Something else coming?
Okay, yeah. So I have a social media presence, and if you check out my social media, you will notice that I have a tendency to provoke, but I kind of look at it as making people think about things that they don't usually think about, and I don't even try to form a cult. If everybody agrees with you, you got a cult.
Yeah.
I don't want everybody to agree with me. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, and I put things out there just to get those type of responses. And people often tell me, you should unfriend this person because they come off on you like that. No, I don't want to unfriend them. I want that kind of input because other people will see how other people think. Some people are bold enough to put those statements out there that they do, and they want to defend them. That's what I want. I want them to put it out there. I want them to make other people uncomfortable, make me uncomfortable. Just be able to be cordial about how you defend yourself. When you get to calling people names and derogatory stuff and things of this nature, you're then out of bounds. Yeah. But if we can have these kinds of conversations, then that's where we need to be.
It's a good thing. I agree. Yeah.
Anything from the comment section?
Well, guys, we are just about out of time. We only have a couple minutes left. Again, this is Stephanie Sperling, the Chief Archaeologist, and I want to thank you both so much for this incredibly enlightening and wonderful conversation. So I want to give it back to you. Do you have anything you'd like to say just to close it out?
Well, I'll wind it down with, I'm still on that long road to find my way to what in native parlance we say, that place that Indians talk about. When I think that I've arrived there, I look behind me and I found out I still got a long way to go. But I'm still looking to find that center, if you will, where my life is fully balanced, that involves all of the things that are necessary for me to travel on this road of life, starting with prayer and not ending, but of course having a lot to do with happiness. So I'm trying to get there, and I keep looking straight ahead. I keep this, as they say, the sun in my face and the wind at my back, and I'll get there.
Yeah, echoes of the Enslaved. This is rewarding for me because, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, I usually come to these sites and I verify that before these places exist, there was a Native American presence. And I go to a lot of sites where I've seen that natives were purged in this effort to form this nation that we have. It is my verification that enslaving Africans was not the first sin, but purging natives was the first sin of this nation in my mind. And I want to try to convince people of that. And we need to atone for that. We need to acknowledge that, and we need some truth and reconciliation, just based on the fact that we exist on a false premise. You know, we talk about the pursuit of happiness. We talked about a more perfect union, and before we can get there, we need to acknowledge our sins of the past. So I want to thank my host for allowing me to join them the second consecutive year. I'm hoping that this is something that we can do far into the future, despite COVID-19 and all the challenges that it brought to us. We still pull this off. We're having this conversation. So it shows hope. You know, we are adapting. We're hoping that on the other side of this virus, that we're going to be able to continue to have these conversations, that we're going to continue to be able to interact. We're hoping that we can bring more people around this campfire in the future, but we'll let the science dictate that. But in the meantime, we'll let our minds do what our minds can do. And our minds are pretty powerful. We just need to think the right thoughts and know that we have the power to live as one.